Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. If you're tired of censorship, outraged by government abuses, and thirsty for real insights, then you're in the right place. Get ready, because here, the fight for freedom never ends. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. I'm glad you could join me today. There is a lot going on. I had a lot of fun last night on Gutfeld, so make sure that if you didn't see it, you check it out. I'll put it out as a bonus episode at some point this week. Also, make sure to follow and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And visit the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com, because you want to share it with your family and friends. It's important that we inform everyone on the issues that impact this great nation, because we have deviated far from the vision of our founding fathers. There's little doubt about that. And we have to ask the question, are the American people in the midst of a war without even knowing it? You know, when we think of war, most of us think of war, we think traditional battlefields. We think of conventional military forces marching under the banner of a nation state. We think of wars over territory, resources, maybe even an attempt to restore justice. You're going to think of war, you're going to envision Afghanistan, Iraq, Al-Qaeda, ISIS. You'll think about Russia, invasion of the Ukraine. You'll think about Israel and Gaza. But what if I told you that currently there is a war being waged, a war not being fought on traditional battlefields, but are being fought within the fabric of our society? And I'm not talking about the culture wars you constantly hear about. I'm talking about a concerted effort by those in power to control our thoughts, our perceptions, our opinions. See, the battlefield is actually our minds. Now, some will say that this is tinfoil hat conspiracy theory. Some are going to say it's out of a Tom Clancy spy novel. But what if it's real? What if this war is happening? And what I'm talking about is fifth generation warfare. I said it on last week's episode. That's what I want to talk about this week. Understand, war has constantly evolved throughout the human experience. And before I explain what fifth generation warfare is, we have to look at how the nature of war has changed. So when it comes to first generation warfare, think back to the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans. Ancient battles like the Battle of Megiddo, the Battle of Marathon, the Punic Wars, so many more. And these battlefields were far away from civilian populations. You know, you had your line, your column formations, that's going to dominate the battlefield. Numbers, discipline, brute physical strength like swords, axes, shields, bows and arrows. That would determine the outcome of a war. Then we morphed into the advancement of firearms and the emergence of the nation state, the Industrial Revolution. And you see how second-generation warfare changed the nature of the battlefield. It was still linear, all right? Second-generation warfare is going to remain linear, but it's going to be more strategic and deadly given the advanced weaponry that's being developed. Now you got trenches and fortifications, artillery barrages, large-scale infantry marching under the banner of a nation state. So you think of World War I. Third generation warfare emerged with the Second World War. Here you see the build out of the military industrial complex, tanks, aircraft, bombs, mechanized infantry. They're all used to achieve strategic mobility. Nazi Germany's blitzkrieg tactics of Poland. See, war would become more organized. It would be more mission oriented and focus mostly on logistics and a more agile force so that you could quickly adapt to the changing nature of the battlefield. The size of the military, while important, it does become less important as technological advances and strategic thinking play a greater role. And as the 20th century wore on, technology continued to advance, mindsets continued to change, well, warfare changed as well. And that's where we get fourth generation warfare. It's going to be less about the nation state and more on non-state actors using asymmetric tactics as they engage in unconventional tactics. Guerrilla warfare, urban warfare, terrorism. Nation states are going to fight less against each other because of the idea of mutually assured destruction, that the risk versus reward isn't worth it. So instead, you're going to use proxy groups to do countries' biddings. And nation states are going to look to alternatives. They're going to look at cyber warfare, information warfare. Now, information warfare has always existed. But through the emergence of the internet, we're going to see it morph and change. It's going to become more organized. People are going to become more radical. People are going to start to lose loyalty and allegiance to the nation state they adhere, that they come from, and they're going to adhere more to some type of rigid ideology. And obviously, groups like Al-Qaeda are going to be the first thing that comes to your mind. When you look at Afghanistan and Iraq, you see how fourth-generation warfare changed the nature of the battlefield. You can have a military that is far more supreme than its opponents, but going to be less effective, right? 20 years in Afghanistan, nearly $2 trillion spent. The entire time we're told we're making progress. 2,400 lives lost, coming home, flag-draped coffins, tens of thousands of wounded. And what happened? What was the end result? Well, within a week, the Taliban was able to recapture control of the country. More powerful, better armed and equipped today than it was prior to us going in. Interestingly enough, when you look at Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that's still more in line with third generation and conventional style of warfare. But we do see elements of fourth generation warfare, right? We see the drone usage, we see the cyber capabilities, but I want to focus on fifth generation warfare. See, this type of warfare, it's psychological. It's not based on guns and bombs. It relies on manipulation of the mind. Fifth generation warfare is an attempt to seize control of and shape ideas. That's what it's about. Control over the perceptions, how we perceive things. Control over our beliefs. Control over the flow of information. Manipulating economies, sowing discord and confusion. Those engaged in fifth generation warfare are going to use subtle means to destabilize and shape the structures of society. And that's the point of this episode. We are in the midst of fifth generation warfare, war that carries grave implications for our civil liberties, our national security, our governance, but most importantly, the very way of life, our republic. This war goes to the heart of the very essence of our republic. And when we get back from this quick break, I want to explain who's behind this, how it's being employed, the intent, and what it means for our future, because I think it's really important. So everyone hang tight. We'll be right back after this quick break. Welcome back, everyone. So let's get to the meat and potatoes of this episode about fifth generation warfare. Who's behind this movement and how is it being employed against us? And many are going to point to the Biden administration, but that oversimplifies it a bit. Okay, it's much deeper. I mean, if we look at the president of the United States, obviously he's not in control. Obviously, he's not the one making decisions. And when we look at the power of the presidency, while it's been enhanced throughout the decades, I mean, the president is far more powerful. The executive branch is far more powerful than it ever was. When we really deep down, it's not necessarily the president that has gained all the power. It's much more complicated. It's the bureaucracy itself. We have this unholy alliance that exists. To a certain degree, this unholy alliance is organized and coordinated, but to another degree, it's actually more decentralized than you actually think. When I say unholy alliance, I'm talking about the bureaucracy, the Marxists, the corporations, the big tech industry, nonprofits, legacy media, academia, all of them in some shape or way partnering together and engaging in fifth generation warfare. But they all have different motives. They all seek different outcomes, and their visions may not align with each other. It's also important to note that when I say decentralized, not everyone involved even realizes what they're engaged in. Not everyone involved has these nefarious intent. They are unwittingly pushing an ideology, a dangerous ideology, an ideology of power and control. See, my focus is on the bureaucracy because they are by far and away the most dangerous of all because of the power that they possess. But even what makes it even more concerning is their thirst for more of that power. To them, they don't want to engage in a marketplace of ideas. They don't have respect for the ordinary American and what we're facing in our day-to-day lives, how we think, what our opinions, what our beliefs are. To them, they want to control the debates. They want to control ideas and opinions. And they do it by controlling the flow of information. Now, the push started long before COVID. A lot of people are thinking that this just sprouted out with the pandemic, but we could trace the origins back to 9/11, and some would even argue that it goes back much further than that. However, It really began to take hold following the 9/11 attacks, where we saw the passage of things like the Patriot Act. We saw the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. We went from a law enforcement-centric approach prior to 9/11 to an intelligence and a preventative approach following 9/11. And that's what opened up this can of worms, the abuses of power, and the real emergence of fifth-generation warfare. Take the NSA, for instance. Their build-out of the PRISM program, where they would collect the metadata of every single American, is the idea behind creating profiles on society. Then fast forward to the mortgage meltdown crisis and the ensuing taxpayer bailouts. Remember, the banks were too big to fail, couldn't let them fail, and so what did the government do? Well, the government made the banks even bigger despite their fiscal mismanagement. And this was a power grab by the government. If the financial sector is dependent on the government for its survival, it's only natural that they're going to become more and more compliant with the governing authority, more importantly, with the bureaucrats and the ideology of the bureaucrats. And what I mean is, rather than a free market force driving our economy, it's now going to be governing authorities that drive economies, weakening and undermining free market mechanisms. The problem is, though, that when governing authorities begin to manipulate economies, they infuse their ideology. Do you think it's a coincidence that corporations began getting involved in social issues that they usually stayed away from? But they started to get involved in social issues following the bailouts and the Great Recession. Do you think it's a coincidence that in 2006, the United Nations issued a report on ESG and for the first time required ESG criteria to be incorporated in the financial evaluations of companies? It's not a coincidence that during the Great Recession from 2007 to 2009, ESG ratings began to play a major role in boardrooms and corporate governance reports. At the same time, governments are bailing out these major corporations. It used to be that when corporations wanted to give back to the community, they build a YMCA or create a park or something. But now they're going to be heavily involved in the social issues framing our society. And you factor in all the ideologues graduating from the universities, the indoctrination centers, staffing human resource departments throughout the country. And this is what I mean when I said not everyone involved even realizes what they're engaged in. I mean, think of Bud Light and the whole Dylan Mulvaney fiasco. The person that made the decision was a Wharton School of Business graduate. She wasn't a zealot, but she was an ideologue, and she didn't even realize it. And that's why it's not hard to see how and why our corporations have become politically weaponized. Then you fast forward to 2012, and you see the IRS Lois Lerner scandal, where she weaponized the IRS to target conservative groups, prevent them from getting tax-exempt status. And just think about all the far-left advocacy organizations that not only push an agenda, but we actually pay for it through our tax dollars. You look at the election of Donald Trump, and the election of Trump in 2016 is going to be a big catalyst for where we are today, because the whole of the bureaucracy was thoroughly disgusted that the American people could go out there and they could support someone like a Donald Trump. This is the moment, it appears, that the bureaucracy and the bureaucrats in power lost all faith in the American public, because people didn't adhere to what the bureaucracy wanted, that they elected a man that the bureaucracy sees as thoroughly unfit for the office of the presidency, and so they looked at it as if the American people made a mistake, and it was their job to correct that mistake. They view the people as ignorant morons, that you don't know what's in your best interest, what's in the best interest of your family, your communities, your country. And because you made that mistake in 2016, well, now the bureaucracy is going to have to take control and correct it. However, the clearest sign of fifth-generation warfare is something that I've talked about before. It's the Biden administration's national strategy for countering domestic terrorism. And even though the Biden administration is the one that put this out there, don't believe for a second that this has to do with his administration. It's actually not about Biden. The document was released under his administration in June of 2021, but you have to realize that this document has been in development for quite some time, long before that. It doesn't matter whether Biden is in office or Trump is in office. It doesn't matter if it's a Democrat administration or a Republican administration. It's about the bureaucracy. And this document empowers them over the administration. Now, I've spoken at length about this document on numerous occasions. You can check out previous episodes where I do a page-by-page analysis. Episode I released in June of 2021 breaking down the document. However, since then, a lot of new listeners have come aboard, so I'm going to quickly break it down because it's one of the most frightening documents ever issued by the government, and numerous bureaucrats and agencies were involved in its creation. See, this document seeks to label and target anyone who dares to dissent from the bureaucratic narrative as potential domestic violent extremists, and this is how fifth-generation warfare is conducted. Just look at who they classify as potential DVEs, domestic terrorists, and it's particularly those that express what they deem as anti-government and anti-authority sentiment. So what does that actually mean? Well, it could be anyone because they never define what constitutes anti-government or anti-authority. And that's the point. They left it vague intentionally. Government bureaucrats are wordsmiths. And notice how they use the words anti-government and anti-authority. It doesn't say anti-American sentiment could lead to potential DVEs. And that distinction is an important one. See, to the bureaucrats, the government and government authority is America. Now, you can bash America all day long, but you're not allowed to bash the bureaucracy or you're going to run the risk of being labeled the domestic terrorist. The national strategy also talks about what it deems incitement. And this is another instance where they leave it intentionally vague. They don't want to define what constitutes incitement. It could be anything. Anything you say, do, or post on social media can be declared incitement. And so you may be contributing to domestic terrorism, right? If I constantly put out posts that question government power and authority, well, can't that be considered anti-government, anti-authority sentiment? And what happens if someone sees my post and then does something really stupid? Well, now, did I incite that individual to do something stupid? And most of fifth-generation warfare is going to fall under the banner of misinformation and disinformation. That's a key tool of this type of warfare. Yet the entire document is based on misinformation. The document reads that those who question and criticize the origins of COVID-19 or the government's authoritarian response to the pandemic create a risk of radicalization. Now think about that for a second. The entire government narrative, along with their tyrannical decrees, is where misinformation and disinformation can be found. They were literally wrong on everything, We know this now. I mean, just think of the 6-foot rule where Dr. Fauci testified. It was just a made-up number. They just, like a dartboard. Let's just put a bunch of numbers. Oh, it landed at 6 foot. Okay, it was all BS. Yet you had people like Dr. Bhattacharya, Dr. Scott Atlas, Dr. Malone, Dr. Peter McCullough, so many others who were right all along, but they were attacked, they were silenced, censored, marginalized based on what the government deemed as misinformation. And that's what it comes down to. When you look at the pillars the national strategy uses to combat so-called domestic terrorism, here's what you need to fear, because it talks about creating private and public partnerships where groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center are going to serve as the eyes and ears of governments, that they're going to become the basis for intelligence. Now, sure enough, we witnessed this with the FBI's Catholic memo, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. But you have these far-left outfits that are now driving the intelligence function within our society. It talks about working with corporations, particularly financial institutions, to track the spending of Americans, circumvent the warrant process, get the corporations to do the government's bidding, to push their agenda. Not only have the corporations push far-left social issues, but they have also begun to close accounts of those whose businesses go against certain ideological narratives. Okay, look at what's going on with small business firearm stores, where they're getting their accounts closed, their bank accounts closed. Banks are saying, well, no, we don't want to do business with you anymore. We don't like the idea that you're selling firearms. It doesn't matter what state legislative bodies do. It's an agenda that's being pushed on millions of Americans. How many individuals and organizations that lean conservative have been targeted over the last several years? And understand that even though conservatives have bore the brunt of this abuse of power, it could be used on anyone, and it will be used on anyone. It doesn't matter what your ideological point of view is. Now, the document explains that in order to prevent domestic terrorism, the government has to control the supply and demand of information, which is nothing more than a fancy way of saying control the flow of information, where the government gets to determine what you see, hear, and say. The last pillar shows how it's not about domestic terrorism at all, that it's really about a far leftist agenda. That if you don't support far left policies like strict gun control, like radical education system based on indoctrination through diversity, inclusion, and equity, if you don't believe in more social programs, well, then you just may be a domestic terrorist. Now, there are going to be many out there that say that, well, not all bureaucrats think this way. This is just a small amount of people that Biden put in positions of power. And no, that's not true. This is a large number of bureaucrats. Sure, it's not every bureaucrat. There are many bureaucrats that I know and speak to regularly that are thoroughly disgusted with the abuses of power that they've witnessed over the last 2 decades. However, if we look at the political campaign contributions coming from bureaucrats, I think it's something like 93% of all campaign contributions from bureaucrats went to the Democratic Party and Democrat candidates. Understand, fifth-generation warfare is real, whether you want to accept it or not. And this is what happens when you have a bureaucracy that's drunk on power. This is what happens when bureaucrats with an inflated sense of ego truly believe that they are smarter than the ordinary people. And when we get back from this quick break, we'll take a look at what's happened since the national strategy has been issued. We're going to look at what the government has done since then and what it means for our future and how we begin to shut this war down, because it's essential we do. So everyone hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. So when we look at the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism, when it was issued in June of 2021, what's happened since then? Well, since then, we saw the Department of Homeland Security announce that it wanted to create the Disinformation Governance Board, where the Disinformation Governance Board, or you could call it the Ministry of Truth, because that's exactly what the intent was, would work with social media companies, and they'd be the ones to determine what's misinformation and disinformation. And while Mayorkas has walked back the idea of the Disinformation Governance Board, the Disinformation Governance Board is alive and well. Don't believe the fraud that it doesn't exist. It certainly exists. And what they're doing now is they're just working with these so-called nonprofit organizations and utilizing the nonprofit organizations to determine what's misinformation and disinformation. Understand, we're talking about billions of dollars here. It goes to nonprofit, private, public organizations. It goes to private corporations, but it also goes to the halls of our university system, where you have the government that's contracting schools to develop tools to identify and correct misinformation and disinformation. I've written several pieces about this, so you can check it out. One of them's on Fox News, tons on Campus Reform, Daily Wire, other outlets out there. But the government is taking the lead on controlling the flow of information. We see it clearly each and every day. And it's now being pushed into academia and all aspects of life. But it's not only just misinformation and disinformation that's concerning. It's also what the government deems as malinformation, information that's true but can cause harm. Think about how terrifying that is. That the government would deem something as malinformation, that they say what the person is saying is correct, but we're going to say that it causes harm, so now they could be targeted as a domestic violent extremist. Should terrify each and every one of you. Following the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism, well, we saw the school board memo come out of the Department of Justice. Parents expressing complaints at school board meetings were now going to be considered as possible extremists. See, you're not allowed to yell at government officials. God forbid you yell at a school board member because you don't like what's being taught to your children. And if you raise your voice, if you get upset about it, well, now you run the risk of getting on the government's radar screen. You look at the FBI's Catholic memo, I brought it up before, the Richmond product, where they used the Southern Poverty Law Center's analysis to say that traditional Catholics may be the new wave of domestic terrorists because of their traditional values, because they're against things like gender ideology, because they believe God created 2 genders, man, woman, that they're somehow going to start turning into the Al-Qaeda of the 21st century. It's completely preposterous. But what it talked about was gaining access, getting in churches, and recruiting informants within these churches. Now, Christopher Wray, the FBI director, pathetic FBI director, said that he shut this down once the memo came to his attention. But that's a lie. This was operational because it wasn't just in Richmond. We saw the same thing happening in California. We saw the same thing happening, I believe it was either in Washington State or Oregon. It could be both. Who the hell knows? And he says that it's being investigated, but there's still a lot of unanswered questions. The investigation should have taken a week, and we should be able to find out more information about who authorized this. Why was it approved? What was the meaning behind it? What was the intent behind it? Because it was nothing more than an ideological intelligence document that was designed to target people that hold traditional values. But there is an intent behind all this. It's to instill that sense of fear. To instill, well, you don't want to be put on the government's radar screen. And so now you're going to self-censor. Anyone that speaks out, you're going to be ostracized, criticized. This is all part of the psychological warfare that goes on when it comes to fifth-generation warfare. You have Jen Easterly, the head of CISA, who came out and stated that she wants cognitive functions to be declared as critical infrastructure protection. I don't think people realize what that means. I don't think people realize how profound that is, that you have a government official stating that cognitive functions is the new battlefield, and that the government, because we're too stupid, right? We can't recognize misinformation and disinformation when we see it. And so the government needs to be able to regulate cognitive infrastructure. That's how they lay it out. This is not a game. It's not a joke. It's not hyperbole. This is what's actually going on. You have these ideologues in position of power that no longer have faith in their people. They no longer exist to serve the people. They believe that the people exist to serve them, to do what these bureaucrats say. And it's not just here in the United States. You have this going on throughout Western civilization, where you have these ideologues in place that are looking to deconstruct Western civilization. They're looking to deconstruct our history, our culture, our founding, the idea and principles of limited government, because that, my friends, is the only way to fix this problem. Is getting back to our roots. And so you have to attack and demonize the founding fathers, the founding of the country. Make people lose faith in it. Make people not understand, not know what actual liberty means, what freedom really is. This is the intent. Because if you don't know, you can't defend it. That's the point. And if they savage the founding fathers enough, if they savage their ideas enough, if they savage them, then everything the founding fathers created is going to be tainted, and it's going to be stained, and it must be deconstructed, including limited government. That's the Achilles heel of the bureaucracy. And we need serious people, statesmen, to go to D.C. that have the cojones to actually say it out loud, but not just say it, actually begin to dismantle the big government apparatus that exists. The bureaucracy is well aware that once it has the power, it's very difficult to weaken its structure and relinquish that power to the people. And it's always going to seek to acquire more and more power and authority. Before you know it, you're going to turn around and you're going to realize that authoritarianism is here. We don't have another several decades of trying to right the ship. The time is now. And we have to defang the bureaucracy that exists as we know it. We have to stop with our reliance, stop looking to government to solve every single aspect within our society. You have a bureaucracy that is more focused on controlling our behaviors than they are when it comes to the actual threats that exist out there, whether it be China and the tens of thousands that are crossing our border, whether it be Russia and Russian ambitions, whether it's Iran in the Middle East, whether it's the amount of radical Islamic terrorists that have crossed the border that were on terrorist watch lists. Understand that if there is a terror attack, the bureaucracy is directly responsible because they were so focused on controlling us that they took their eye off the ball. They saw us, we the people, as a bigger threat than the terror organizations that want to strike us. They failed. And if we go back to our founding principles, we can right the ship. We could ensure that our generation, our children's generation, and their children's generation will remain in a free society where the values of liberties are upheld, where the concept of the republic remains intact, where our Constitution remains the supreme law of the land that limits and restricts the government, not the people. With that being said, I hope you found this episode informative. Please share it with your family and friends and on social media. Please leave the P.A.S. Report a 5-star rating. Take 30 seconds to write a review. I want to thank you for joining me today, and I'll be back next week with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report. Don't forget to rate, share, and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll never miss an episode. For more exclusive content and updates, visit us at PASreport.com and follow Professor Giordano on all social media platforms at P.A.S. Report.